everyone, welcome to Modern Application Development Part 2. Now we are going to continue on our journey through JavaScript, and in this set of videos we are going to be looking at some slightly more advanced topics in the context of JavaScript. So we will start with collections. Okay, and what do I mean by JavaScript collections? The most basic form of a collection is an array, and what do we do with arrays? We basically want to be able to look at the items one at a time, right? Which is basically a concept called iteration, which we will look at. There are also some things like multi-dimensional arrays that can be implemented and a few other concepts that we need to look at. What I'm going to do is first cover some of these concepts at a sort of slide level, where I just sort of talk about them, and then we will switch over and look at some examples using Replit. So the basic idea of an array is that it's a collection of objects, right? And the interesting thing about JavaScript arrays, unlike let's say a C array, is that the objects can be of any type. Right? Now in C, when I declare an array, I usually declare it as an array of int or an array of short or an array of char, or in some case it could be that I have defined a string data type and therefore I could have an array of strings, right? But in JavaScript, I can basically have a mixed set of values, right? So in this sense, it is very close to what a list in Python is like. Lists in Python are also mixed type, right? Whereas an numeric Python array has a very specific data type that is applied to all the elements in the array. So even though in JavaScript these are called arrays, they are closer to the lists in Python and are more sort of generic collections. Okay. Now, what are the things that we would want to do with arrays? We want to be able to access any given element in the array. We want to find the length of the array, that is the number of elements in the array. And over here, there is also one interesting thing which comes up in the context of JavaScript, which is not really there in other languages so much, which is that you can create an array with holes in it. Okay, what is that? We'll get to that soon. And of course, one of the most important things you want to do with an array is, after all, you have put a number of different items together into one collection, presumably because they have something in common, right? Otherwise, I mean, why even bother to put them into the same array or collection? Which means that you might also want to sort of iterate over them, that is, go over each one of those elements and do something, right? Call a function or print them out or do something else. But for doing that, we need to be able to sort of iterate over all the elements in the array sequentially. So all of these things are what we are going to look at. Now, the idea of iteration or iteration, right, both pronunciations seem to be common enough, is to go over all the elements in a collection, right? And there are a couple of concepts over here in the language of JavaScript. They refer to something called an iterable, or an iterable is an object whose contents can be accessed sequentially. Okay. So you can think about this. I mean, if you, after all, in JavaScript, in principle, everything is an object. Right, so you could just have an object which is like a number 1, right? And 1 is not really an object whose contents can be accessed sequentially. There is only one piece of content over there, right? So there is no sort of concept of sequential access. And similarly, if I just have a single character A, then same thing, right? You don't really have any concept of accessing the character. After all, there is only one of them sequentially. But pretty much anything else can be iterated over. Okay, and what is it that does the iteration? You need to have a pointer to where you are right now, and you need some way of sort of moving forward in that iteration, right? And the iterator is basically the pointer to the next element, and how we implement that iterator function will finally decide how iteration happens on a collection. Now, the reason for having this sort of abstract description is that you are no longer just limited to very single for loops or while loops. You can also do something more complicated where you can create an object and make it iterable and define new kinds of functionality on it. Okay. Now, the most basic iterable objects in JavaScript are, of course, arrays, which we are looking at. But apart from that, even a string, right? A JavaScript string can be iterated over. Similarly, there are a couple of other objects called maps, sets, and there is also something called a weak map, right? Which are slightly more advanced topics. We are not really going to get into those. All of those can be iterated over, meaning that there is some notion of multiple entities being present inside such an object, and you can go through those in sequence. And from the point of view of JavaScript and its application to the web, the browser DOM, which is basically some kind of a tree structure, right, the document object model itself can be iterated over. Okay, so it's possible to sort of traverse the entire document object model, right, by saying next, 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 and going through all the elements one by one. Okay, that becomes useful when you are basically going through the different processing of the DOM. Now, there are some helper functions that are defined in terms of objects, right, things like object.keys, object.entries, and so on. We will look at these a little bit later when we get to the examples of code. Now, in addition to this, and this is something that we will be looking at more when we get to the examples, we have functions that can take functions as input. Okay, so this whole idea of a function being passed as an argument to another function is a very powerful construct, right? It can be done even in a language like C. You do have this concept of function pointers and how you can pass function pointers as input to other functions and so on. But in a language like C, it is cumbersome at best, right? I mean, you have to sort of be very clear that this is a function, this is a pointer to a function, and I am therefore sort of, passing around pointers to the functions and so on. Whereas languages like Python and JavaScript make it a lot easier. They almost treat functions as sort of first class objects, right? Which means that a function can itself be treated as an object in some way. Now, where this really becomes powerful is that there are certain classes of functions, right? These map, filter, find, and so on are some examples of those. And effectively what they do is they apply something called a callback function, right? So there is an additional function that is passed into, let's say, map, right? And this idea of a callback, right, is a very important concept. It basically says there's a function which is passed into another function, and depending on something that happens internally in the top level function, the function that was passed in as an argument would be called back. Okay, now why is that useful? There are a number of different types of functionality that can be realized in this way, right? And all of these are sort of related to some concepts of what's called functional programming, right? It allows us to sort of create chains of transformations and also pass functions around and have different kinds of behavior depending on different scenarios that are present. Okay, but we will not be getting into any details on functional programming, why it is useful or how it is done. What is useful to know is that JavaScript sort of allows you to do some of those things, and more than anything else, it makes the syntax relatively easy, right? Remember, like I said, even in C you can do this kind of callbacks, right? Except that it's somewhat cumbersome to do. Whereas in JavaScript or Python, it becomes a lot easier because the language syntax allows it in a more sort of fluid manner. Okay, and that's primarily what we are looking for over here. There are some other collections in JavaScript. In particular, there is a concept of a map, right, which is essentially the equivalent of a Python dictionary. But as we will see, you can actually even just use regular JavaScript objects almost like dictionaries, right? So do you really need a map? What are the benefits of using maps? We'll not be getting into too many details on those. In fact, there is something else called a weak map and a set and a weak set. All of those are things that were brought into JavaScript relatively recently with the aim of sort of, making certain kinds of coding more well structured, right? Now, by now you have probably understood that, JavaScript, the real power lies in the fact that it had a very simple sort of definition to start with, right? It was very flexible, which meant that even structures that did not exist in the language, so for example, proper block level scoping, right, or classes, even though they did not exist in the language to start with, people were able to sort of hack around it, right, and come up with ways of implementing proper scoping using IIFs, right, immediately invoked function expressions, or they could, for example, have object orientation using some notion of something called prototypes, right. The point is, those are somewhat difficult to use, and more importantly, they are difficult to read and understand, right. So a lot of these newer changes, including the introduction of data types like maps and so on, has been done with the aim of making JavaScript a little easier to read and understand for others. Okay, you could have a lot of the core functionality without requiring these things as well. So in our case, what we are going to do is we will only be looking at some of these things as and when needed. We are not going to be sort of getting deep into them and trying to understand how these work straight away. Now, one last thing with regard to collections is that there is one interesting idea that can be used over here, which is called destructuring. Once again, this is just part of the language syntax. Right? It's not a sort of new concept in the language as such. What it provides is a simple syntax that allows us to split an array into multiple values. Okay, and there are a number of uses that have been found for this in JavaScript, right? Including the ability to sort of pass the so-called function arguments can be passed by name rather than passed by position, right? You can have a concept of basically using named arguments, which is there in Python, of course, but which is not really there in C by default. Okay. So that can be powerful in a lot of cases. It allows you to sort of set default argument values and various other things. And JavaScript, even though it doesn't have it as part of the syntax, is able to achieve the same kind of functionality using some very simple syntactic constructs. So we'll briefly look at that as well at some point. Now, finally, there is this notion of something called a generator, right? And a generator, and this is a slightly advanced topic, so we are not really going to get too deep into this. Having said that, the reason I'm introducing it over here is because, especially for those of you who are interested in learning more about JavaScript and understanding in particular some concepts like concurrent execution, the idea of a generator is important to know. Okay, and a generator is basically a function that yields values. Okay, so what this keyword yield is in fact used inside the generator, and the idea behind that yield is to say that whenever it's sort of the equivalent of a return statement, except that it's not exiting the function completely. It's just saying that at this point in time, the function is giving a value and saving its present state and waiting to be restarted from the point where it left off. Okay. Why is this useful? It basically allows us to think in terms of functions that are sort of cooperating with each other, right? One function yields a value to another one, the other one does something with it, exits, and we go back to the original function and continue from where we left off, right? So in principle, both the functions are active and functioning at the same time, right? That is a notion called concurrency, which is very powerful and is sort of the basis of parallelism. Concurrency does not mean the same as parallelism, but is in some sense required if you want to be able to implement parallelism. So generators are functions that sort of take you in that direction, right? They allow you to sort of yield values and have multiple functions operational at the same time. It sets up the stage for what's called cooperative concurrency, right? And there are a number of sort of advanced topics over here, computed iterables, dynamically generated iterators, and so on, which we are not going to get into any details at this point. Alright, so now that we have looked at some of the, as we can say, theory behind collections, it's not exactly theory, it's sort of just a more a description of a few of the concepts that we can look at. Let's look at code, right? Because ultimately, in order to learn a language, the best way is to actually look at the code and understand what it's doing. So once again, I'm going back to the Replit example that I had. I have this index.html, right, which is a very basic code. All that it does is pretty much just puts hello world on the screen. In the previous videos, we had seen, how the divs could be declared and we could actually sort of insert data into it, right, modify it and so on, and essentially showing how the JavaScript APIs can interact with the DOM. Now, I'm not going to be using a lot of that right now. What I do have is there are a bunch of scripts, but most of them are commented out. There's only one that's active currently, which is collections. Okay, so let's go see what's in collections. Now, this first part is in some sense the most basic form of declaring an array, right? What we have is let x equals 1, 2, 3. Okay. And what we can see over here is I'm going to basically log something saying $. Remember this backtick method that we use, right? Which basically is sort of a templating string, right? So once I have that backtick over here, inside that $ and the curly brackets, anything inside of that will actually get evaluated. So $type of x should actually run the type of function on x, which in this case is a array, right? And print something out, the actual array itself, and also tell you what the length of the array is. Okay, and the second statement console.log x of 0 should pick out the first element, because these are again like Python 0 indexed. Okay, so what happens when I run this? I find that the first thing it says is that this is an object. Okay, so keep in mind, I mean, even though I had declared it using these square brackets in this way, as far as JavaScript is concerned, this is an object. It doesn't really think of it as a array data type. Okay, it is ultimately an object. That's pretty much what it is. Okay, there are other ways of sort of finding out whether it is an instance of an array and so on, but for the time being, we are not really getting into that. Okay, all right, let's go a bit further. And what happens if I, let's say, have another array that I declare, but now look at this second array y, right? I've got 1 over here, the second element is b, and the third element is actually, well, take a moment and think about it, right? What is this actually doing? Remember the arrow notation, right? What it's saying is it takes an input a and converts it, right, into a plus 1. So Replit has this nice behavior where when you hover over a particular syntactic construct in the code, it actually shows the small tooltip, right, hanging above this that part, and clearly it shows that this is basically a function, right? And what kind of a function is it? It takes a as input, where a is of any type, right? It's not necessarily an integer, it could be anything, and it returns any type. Okay, now why is that being written over here? Because we are not specified the type of a. JavaScript by itself does not have a way by which it specifies types, unlike C, for example, right? Now there is a variant of JavaScript, not exactly a variant, it's actually almost a language of its own called TypeScript, where you actually have to explicitly specify types, right? And that leads to a lot of very useful optimizations that the compiler can do, which lead to sort of better functioning JavaScript and in general, you know, better debugging capabilities at least, right? In some cases, even performance optimizations can be performed that could not have been done in pure JavaScript. But basic JavaScript does not have that notion of types. So this notation here, function a colon any is more a sort of shorthand that people understand rather than being part of JavaScript itself. Alright, so, you know, long story short, let's run it with y over here, right? And what we find is that the second one once again comes out to be an object, right? Y is also an object. The contents of y are 1, b, a and a plus 1, right? And with length equal to 3. Okay. Now, this, we could go one step further over here, right? And yeah, in fact, we will get to that later. So, you know, for the time being, let's just leave this aside. The important point over here was that I could have an object with mixed data types. I could have a number, I could have a character, and I could have a function, all of them as being part of the same array, right? And the length of both x as well as y are essentially the same. They were determined just by the fact that the number of elements in each over there. Okay. Now I can do one thing further, which is basically to say that I can essentially null out an entire collection or an array. Right? What happens when I do that? I find that x has now become, it continues to be an object, but now its length is equal to 0. So just setting it to null like this effectively deleted everything that was there inside x. Okay. Now this next stage here is a little bit more interesting, right? What I'm going to do is y.length equal to 10. Okay. Now normally in Python, for example, the length of a function is not something that you can change, and the length of an array or a list is not something that you directly change, right? It's a computed parameter. But in JavaScript, it looks like you can actually assign directly to the length. So what happens? When I do this, I find that now, right, maybe it's easier if we comment out all the other console lines. Right? And run this, what we find is that y has now become an object with length equal to 10. And if you look at it, look at what it's printed out. The first element was 1, then the character b, then the function a to a plus 1, and then just commas one after the other, right, with nothing in them, right? So basically saying, in other words, that yes, there is data there, but none of it basically has any value. Okay, they are all undefined or null. Okay, what exactly is it? That depends on how you iterate through it and what you're trying to get the value out of it. Basically, if you try directly accessing, let's say, y of 4, you'll find that it's undefined because it's not been initialized.